Well, welcome to one more edition of Off the Cuff or OTC. And I guess today, the Prime Minister once said, I think during election campaign in UP, he said that economists from Harvard have been proven wrong. And this is hard work versus Harvard. So I think Harvard has not quite won that battle, but Harvard's competition, Princeton has won that battle. Because Surjit Bhalla, noted economist, Prime Minister has included him in his Economic Advisory Committee. Surjit is a wonderful intellectual. The most important thing is he's never afraid to speak his mind, and he takes risks, both as a columnist, as a writer, both as a columnist writer and as an economist. So Surjit, you have a new book now, The Wealth of Nations. It's a bit cautious compared to your columns.
No.
But we shall forgive you for that. Look forward to the conversation. I am privileged also that I am being led in this conversation by Nandan Nilekani. Nandan, thank you very much for agreeing to do this.
No, I think I had a chance to read your book, Surjit. It was fascinating. But I think to me, the key theme that you were making is that education trumps everything, that education is the basis for society's improvements and so on. So can you explain what you had in mind when you say that education is the thing that has changed the world in the last 60 years?
Let me quote from Neil Ferguson, one of the leading intellectuals in the world. And if you go and just type in while you're doing your social media, the 6 killer apps of development, of growth, okay? And this was a TED Talk back in 2011 or 12. So he labels these, and it's all about what is the big story of our times? The Industrial Revolution, and how the Western advanced economies are so much richer than the rest of the world, right? This is what we grew up with, this is a fact, and this is the divergence between the incomes of the West and the rest is huge. So this has been a much-studied topic by the economists, by political scientists, by sociologists, and what Neil Ferguson summarizes this literature by saying that the 6 killer apps of growth, okay, we're now talking about growth, and we'll perhaps get into distribution later, is competition, the wealth of nations, this is Adam Smith himself, science, and that's technology, property rights, and this has been a favorite amongst the economists, that property rights is what distinguishes Argentina and Brazil from Western Europe and the US. Modern medicine, which really is part of the same. Consumerism and work ethic. Notice, education not mentioned at all. So that's the first fact that, and as an aside, that it was only in 1960 when what I think the leading economist of the 20th century, a person called Gary Becker, who wrote that really education determined income. Prior to that, amongst the economists, amongst the intellectuals, etc., not amongst the people. People instinctively knew what determined income. But amongst all the economists, etc., it was your connections, which school you went to, whether you went to Harrow or Eton or Doon or whatever. And education was just by the by. It was and there was a term for it, social capital. So your social capital determined your income. Now, we had, for whatever reason, and I think education is behind the reason why the US trumped England in the 19th century, why the Industrial Revolution happened, and so on and so forth. But let that be. What we know is that in 1960, at the same time that Gary Becker was writing about how education determines income, there was another Nobel laureate by the name of Gunnar Myrdal, who wrote a 3-volume essay, 3 volumes of books, called The Asian Drama. And in that, he basically gave up Asia for dead. That is, Asia has no hope, particularly India and China, the 2 largest countries in Asia. And what happened? The biggest revolution, and there's a third revolution that's coming. The one revolution was the Industrial Revolution. The second revolution is what I try and address in this book, is the last 60 years, or last 40 years, to be more precise, is the revolution in the developing world, who suddenly, nobody thought that they would grow at the exponential rates that they have. And it's not just China, and it's not just India, and it's not just Korea, it is not just Singapore, it is not just Chile, it's not just Brazil, the entire mass. And sub-Saharan Africa is now catching up with it, that the reason these economies grew and grew so fast was because of education. So the major thesis in this book is that education is a determinant of everything that we know and call development and growth.
No, but when you talk education, are you referring to mass, primary, and middle school education? Are you talking about graduate education? What is your...
It is, before we run, we need to walk. And you can't do, and this is one of the things I mentioned in the book as to where India went drastically wrong, was in emphasizing higher education at the expense of primary and secondary education. We did that, and that was because of a certain concept. And at that time, when we started doing it, that it wasn't recognized that education was wealth, or Gary Becker hadn't quite arrived when Nehru started the temples of wisdom called the IITs. But most developing countries really, and starting with China, but Korea, Malaysia, you name it, started broadening the base. So therefore, primary education is very important, secondary education is very important, and today, in today's globalized world, higher education is very important. So, but you can't get to higher education unless you first do primary and secondary.
So you're saying the choice of investing in higher education, and assuming that you had a limited budget, and the choice was either higher education or primary, let's say, if that was the binary at that time, was that the biggest single strategic mistake made post-independence?
I would count it amongst, I don't want to say the biggest, but amongst
you have many in your list.
So we made 2 big mistakes. One, not emphasizing sanitation, because that really affects everything. And the second mistake was in not broadening the base of education.
Did it have to be either or? See, higher education, you might say an IIT takes a lot of money to build. First of all, a lot of the early IITs had foreign aid, they were foreign supported.
Yeah, all of them actually. All 5,
yeah.
Top 5.
Second, in the overall scheme of things, it didn't have to be an either or thing. It's not as if because you built these higher institutions, you had no money left to do school education. Or was it because primary education or school education wasn't sexy enough?
Exactly. No, I think, look, it's never either or. You have to do both. And there are trade-offs that those in charge of policy have to make all the time, and those who advise on policy also have to think about the trade-offs.
Yeah, so, no, but I think to get back to the education thing, I mean, when other countries went on their economic growth trajectory, Japan, Korea, China, Southeast Asia, they already had universal literacy by that time, right?
Well, this is where it comes to Shekhar's point as to either or whatever. So how do we find out whether India did right or wrong? And we find out by looking at what other countries did. And other countries, the reason they got to higher literacy is because they started with expanding the base and then proceeding First learning to walk and then attempting to run.
So here is a proposition before we move on from education to other points. That our big blunder was not focusing on institutions of higher learning, the IITs, the IIMs, the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. You need those to build excellence. Our big blunder, that's a proposition that I'm putting to you, was setting up the UGC and starting state funding of all degree colleges. As a result, all our household budgets actually become lighter when our children go from school to college.
Yes,
college
exactly.
College
That's
education
wrong.
in India,
Yeah.
including St. Stephen's, Hindu in Delhi, I bet the same thing applies elsewhere.
Yeah.
Our children go to college at 80 rupees a month. And if you increase it by 10 rupees,
Then there are riots.
then there are riots. Would you recommend to Mr. Modi to abolish UGC now?
So
what's
therefore-
what's your view on UGC's future?
No, I think, look, as I said, we have done it wrong. You know, the fascinating thing about India, and we all Indians, we all love the place and will continue to love it, is that, and this is, other people have also noted it, but I'm trying to emphasize, you know, if there's anything possible wrong that a policymaker can do anywhere in the world at any time in history, we've done it here. It really, I mean, it is, you know, whether it is in taxation, whether it is in education, whether it is in environment. I mean, you know, in some sense, we need a revolution, and I think that revolution is going to come about because of the revolution of education. Let me just express to you what we've lost. And here's a comparison, which I discuss in the book as well. The India-China comparison. Between 1500 and 1980, per capita incomes in India and China were about the same. We were about the same, plus minus 10, 15, sometimes China was rich, sometimes India was rich, the same for 480 years. And then in the short space of 30 years, China leapfrogged, and their per capita income is 2.5 times that of ours. That's our opportunity
I
cost.
think it's a bit more than that.
No, that's in I'm saying PPP terms, but yes, in dollar terms, it's 4 times.
4 times, yeah.
My question is education not being given the priority it ought to, at least primary education in the rural areas and those places, because an educated population questions politicians, they ask questions, they demand answers, and they throw the bums out. And our bums don't want to be thrown out. They want to keep their bums in the seats of power. Is that a cynical point of view?
No, I think it's a reasonably accurate point of view, but the point is that thankfully the times they are changing, or the times have changed, and now the education is quite widespread, and the bums are being thrown out, and should be thrown out. I will add a should to it.
I'd like to know, if you do an audit trail, how much you lay it on the fiscal policy of the central government or state government, and how much on the monetary policy, Reserve Bank of India. My second question is, why is that the parliament feels inferior to take accountability of Reserve Bank? And third is it a lot of misery in India is also on account of lack of accountability of the central bank?
There are two determinants of growth, or aiding and abetting growth, besides education. You want to accelerate it, so on and so forth. In the modern world, it is monetary policy and fiscal policy. Okay? You know, the first thing you're taught as an economist is that the demand curve slopes downwards. Higher the price, less the demand. Lower the price, higher the demand. Except in a country called India. Interest rates don't matter. You get central bank governors saying interest rates don't matter. Animal spirits matter. वो जो पहले जो पुराने animal spirits matter. और क्या था? Environment matters. Oil prices matter. But interest rates don't matter. अरे किस दुनिया में रह रहे हो यार? I mean, it's embarrassing. I will say it very concretely. Anybody who says that interest rates don't matter, this is, a serious problem. And if you see, in 2009, I did a chapter edited by Shankaracharya and Rakesh Mohan, two very close friends of mine, S's in honor of Montague, where I spell this out there. What world are you guys living in that you believe that there is no such thing as a demand curve? So my simple answer to that, and we are losing out around the world, fiscal policy. So about the only instrument you have for both enhancing growth and decelerating growth is interest rates. So you need to think about, why is it that we are following a policy of decelerating growth?
Scope for rate cuts even now.
Last October, the RBI cut interest rates by 25 basis points. When you're asking for what's the room, right? The previous 8 months inflation was 5.5%. The RBI, I'm talking about the MPC, said, we believe, this is Michael Patra, we believe, or the RBI believes, that we should target a real policy rate of 1.25%. This is all matter of public record. This is not what I think. What do you think? This is what the RBI thinks. Us waqt se, since last October, real interest rates, policy rates, their definition, not mine, has gone nearly tripled. Tripled. From 1.25%, it has averaged 3.2% over the last 14 months. And you are asking me, is there room for a rate cut?
Because when you read financial papers also,
of course,
the argument always is that inflation is going up, growth is now picking up. In fact, RBI is going to be more hawkish, and there is no scope for rate cuts now. Forget it.
Exactly. And why read the papers? RBI Governor Patel in the August meeting said, oh, inflation has gone up by 200 basis points. This is an official policy statement of the RBI. We need to get worried. What had inflation gone up from? 1.5, which is the lowest rate ever, to 3.5. And we have an RBI governor saying that he's very worried about rising inflation.
So you are expecting a change of heart now?
I am expecting a change of heart because I think we are really hurting the economy.
I'm Sucharita Ishwar. The recent World Bank study shows that more women are being educated. In fact, there are more women engineers coming out than male engineers, but their participation in the workforce is declining from 35% in 2005 to 27% in 2012, and declining further. So I'd like to know your perspective on what you think about that. You spoke about education being the great decider and contributing to prosperity, economy, etc. So if 50% of the population is not participating in the mainstream economy, so where are we going?
No, look, to state that this is the import of your question, that there was a paper done in 2009 by Ravinder Kaur, who happens to be my wife, and myself, and it's available on the web for the LSE, that found out that the one major reason for the labor force participation rate for women to have declined is that we use the definition ages 15 to 59 as being in the labor force or not. So we separate out, you look at 15 to 24, which is when you're likely to be, you're likely to be in school. And a large part of that decline was explained by the fact that more and more women were going to school, young girls were going to school. Nevertheless, so that was ended in 2011-12, 2009-10 actually. Nevertheless, it is a puzzle as to why Indian women have shown a backward bending curve, that as soon as their family or their incomes, joint incomes, reach a certain level, they withdraw. I think that is your point, and it's a valid empirical point. All I would say is that, as I said, I've looked at this, I've studied this, just wait 5 years, because the change in the education of the women and the empowerment has been very, very rapid over the last 10, 15 years. Just to give you one example of how rapid. In 1983, young urban women, ages 15 to 24, and I'm going to compare them with urban young men, 15 to 24, had 2/3 of the education of urban young men. 1983, not that long ago. Okay. And they had 2/3 of the wages, those who worked. Separate question of whether they were in the labor, but they chose to work, they had 2/3 of the wages. In 2011-12, young urban women have 0.1 years more education than young men and 3% more wages. So what we've seen is a very, very rapid change in the educational profile of women, the attitudinal change, which is the real thrust of your important question. We are in the witnessing stages as we speak. That is happening. So all I'm saying is, let's wait even till next year when 2017-18 NSS data comes out. I think we'll be quite surprised by this. But it is a puzzle. Let's leave it as a puzzle. Education is part of the puzzle, but not all of it. And if I'm right, education is all of the puzzle.
My name is Madan Bahal. You mentioned about the difference in socio-economic development of China versus India. Did education play a role, or the education policy play a role between where these two countries stand today in terms of socio-economic development? That's one. Of course, everything that was wrong about India was because of Congress and UPA. Is the BJP trying to do anything right, or the current government trying to do anything right that's trying to fix this policy?
Look, let me take the easy second part. Look, look, of course, you know, by definition, if a party has ruled India from 1947 to 2014, and only 10 years there was some other party, then it has to be, by definition, good or bad, it has to be the Congress. I mean, you know, it's a no-brainer. So only after now 10 years or so we'll be able to think about making the comparison between, you know, left of center and a right of center. I like to think of it in terms of left of center and right of center, whether the profit motive is evil or the profit motive is not evil, Fabian socialism versus market socialism. And another example of the changing of the old elite and the new elite, etc., is that we all talk about crony capitalism. What we had in India, and we still have, but it's changing, was crony socialism. So I just want to plug that in, that it is not. So that's the easy part. The more difficult question, China versus India. Very important, yeah. China versus India, you know, they are very, look, I'll give you two reasons why the growth rate of China happened, why the divergence started to take place from 1980 onwards. The first was the education, which had already happened before. Okay? And remember, the Chinese had, you get educated, go work in the fields. Okay? So if we made mistakes, those guys have made equal mistakes. But that was prior to 1980. Post-1980, they're making mistakes. Another example of the mistakes in China versus the mistakes in India is the sex ratio. So the Chinese felt they needed to control population growth. So therefore they said, okay, you can have only one child. That was their approach. Our approach, which thankfully didn't succeed for too long, so it's not even an approach, was Nasbandi. But after that, it was, okay, development will take care of itself and so on and so forth. The fertility rate, the replacement fertility rate in India today is 2.1%. Okay? So we did it our way. And I think eternally thankful of our way rather than their way. So it is not as if, growth is the only consideration.
So what does this mean for people like us who don't understand? Replacement fertility rate is 2.1%.
That means that an average couple, I was going to say an average woman, but it is an average woman, that they will have 2 kids over their entire fertility cycle, and that's what you need to replace the population. So the reason our population growth rate is now down to 1.1, 1.2%. I mean, so one of the big shockers in the future is how fast our population growth rate will decline.
So all these Pew projections and all will all come.
The UN is living in another world.
Yeah, that's the way they projected our
Along with
our HIV figures.
Yeah.
You're saying this, but the UNDP chief is coming into Delhi.
So coming back, so the other thing that China did, the first form of reform, which I think is not a bad phrase, was agriculture. We have not, so the big 1991 reforms came. We did not reform agriculture at all. And neither did Bajpayee. So come back to your political thing. That is being attempted for the first time in Indian history. They did it to begin with. They'd already done the education part. They did then the agricultural part because a large part of the population was engaged in agriculture. We didn't do that. And that is where our elites thought of a different model. So don't think in terms of, Congress and all, which will lead you astray. It is, Congress had to have been. I mean, so we made mistakes. It so happened that the Congress was in power when we made mistakes. But
just to repeat this, Surjit, what you're saying is that the news on population growth is very good.
Absolutely, and it's completely underestimated.
Stop worrying about this
Absolutely.
Explosion.
So what will it peak at?
This I'm actually in the process of doing. But it is the case that, look, and the reason the population growth rate is as high as it is, we're all living longer around the world, but especially in a young country, etc. So it is in a number that I'm very seriously, and to compare it with the UN estimates and see where. But the preliminary estimates are that the UN is out to lunch in terms of our population growth rate.
My name is Prem Chandavarkar. Why does the public discourse on the health of the economy center on this narrow measure of GDP growth rather than a broader measure like the Human Development Index, which would factor in the question of education that you raised?
I've spent a lot of time, when I was at the World Bank, outside the World Bank, I even wrote a book called Imagine There's No Country, in measuring absolute poverty. Okay? What percentage of the population is poor? And going through, you're asking, is there anything else besides GDP? So I'll take a slightly circuitous, not too. So, and the World Bank has spent tons of money, $1 poverty line, this, that, so many people are poor, 1 billion poor, world free of poverty, sab kuch. And basically the major beneficiaries of that have been the economists who have worked on it, like myself. So no. But listen to the following statistic. Okay. So you want to know, okay, how many poor people there are. Right? Now, and the World Bank definition. So take whatever definition you have. From 1870 to now, the fraction of the population illiterate is almost identically equal to the fraction of the population absolutely poor. So unfortunately or fortunately, income captures a lot of this other stuff. So, and I mentioned the Human Development Index, etc. Usse koi farak nahi padta. You know, you look at the education profile, look at the health profile, all of that is very, very consistent with per capita income. So it is not as if people like me say, go after per capita income. It's just as an economist, you know, where you want to make an assessment on little data, it is the per capita income. You do have the HDI index from 1993 onwards, etc. It just doesn't work as well. That's the only.
Right there in the back.
Hi, I'm Sunita Nadamuni. I work on technology for preventive healthcare. If you look at the parallels with education, do you see that there needs to be a focus on primary healthcare as opposed to, you know, more of a focus on primary healthcare as opposed to secondary and tertiary? And the second is, in trying to go towards universal healthcare, do you believe that the model of going with, health insurance is the right way to go for India?
Okay. Let me just give you my biases completely up front. I am a big believer in universal healthcare. So that's number one. Number two, how to achieve universal healthcare, you really have to expand on the primary healthcare side. So I think the analogy with education is near complete. So if education works in transforming lives and transforming incomes and making development in the way it does, that's exactly the healthcare model. So you should have universal healthcare. The financing of it, we need to be innovative. And I've given you one idea of how to be innovative on education. I think, you know, some innovative ideas need to be there such that you need to have incentives for the doctors, you need to have incentives for the patients to economize so you don't overuse, all those things. But the shortest distance to improving the healthcare is primary.
In fact, my surprise with the book is that Surjit Bhalla, who Chidambaram once described to me, I think he wrote a column very critical of his policies when he was finance minister. He said, he's to the right of Adam Smith. So Surjit Bhalla, to the right of Adam Smith, in this book actually bats for universal basic income. So Surjit, will you hold forth on that a little bit?
Actually,
are you having a change of mind, heart?
No.
Are you the same?
No, this one is a very serious, it's a very serious point. And I don't bat for universal basic income, but he is right that I was surprised myself coming to this conclusion. For a long time, I believed that growth solves all problems, lifts all boats, and you need to give equality of opportunity. And that is...
Yours are lifted, sir.
Yeah. So you have equality of opportunity and the growth will take care of everything. Broadly, it's a caricature, but broadly I believe. Where I've changed is that we are now entering with the fantastic global supply of education, which leads to almost zero inflation in the Western world for the last 30 years. And that's, if you're thinking of where the RBI is thinking or should be thinking, we should discuss that. But the fact remains that in this world, think broadly what is going to happen. And this also leads to what is happening in Charlottesville and what I draw the analogy with Gaurakshaks in India. The bottom 10, 15% of men are going to completely lose out in this modern world. Okay? Because everybody's educated. Remember, this is including the West, including here, obviously, but they're going to lose out in the West, so you can imagine what happens to them in countries that don't have as spread out education. Then you have, and for them, you have to have basic transfers. The universal basic income only is not universal, it is to the bottom 15%, cash transfers, DBT. So the Indian version, direct benefit transfer. Then for the next 15, 20%, you will need a negative income tax to provide incentives to supplement their incomes. And remember, it's not a coincidence that the richest country in the world, Switzerland, just a year ago had a referendum. They rejected the referendum, but that time will come. So it's not so much universal, but I think active intervention to uplift the bottom third of the population is needed. Growth alone will not do it.
My name's Anand. I run a startup focused on training teachers. What are your recommendations for improving both the quantity and quality of teachers in India? And number two, for the most part in India, there's a ban on private education institutions. You can only be non-profit. Should that ban be lifted or not? And will we see that happening anytime soon?
Look, I've never understood this Indian obsession with bans. Look, studying education in India, that the quality of teachers, and by quality, let's make it minimal. Does the teacher show up to school to teach? And let's forget universities, where there's also a big problem, colleges. But primary school, secondary school, teachers just don't show up. Second, the teachers, and it's 40, 50%, it's not a small number, and a lot of documented studies on this. Second, the salaries that they are paid compared to what teachers in the private sector get is, lack of a better word, obscene. So we need to think this entire salary structure, this edifice that we have constructed, call it classic socialist, or whatever, which is really, crony socialism. You've created a subset of people in industry, in labor, in teachers that are the elite, or that are the favored, and the rest of us come outside of that. So it is a rethink, and I think global competition will force us to rethink because there are a lot of entrenched interests. After all, we have cockroaches and they live long and long and long. And the entrenched interests live even longer. So it's not an easy battle.
The last word on data security and privacy with regard to Aadhaar.
No, I think certainly on the privacy thing, the Supreme Court has come out with a very far-reaching verdict on the fundamental right to privacy, which says that while privacy is a fundamental right, it can be circumscribed by the state, and gives 4 examples when there is national security, crime, protection of revenue, and social welfare. And when the state does restrict privacy, it has to be based on law, it has to be proportional and reasonable. So there's a very well-defined judgment of the court, and I think the Aadhaar will completely stand the test of that. So I think that's really what it is.
What happened with the National Knowledge Commission? UPS set it up with great enthusiasm, and then it fell by the wayside. You people did a lot of work.
Well, I think there are a lot of recommendations, but ultimately they have to be accepted by the system.
Why did the government lose?
No, I think the big thing on higher education is the proposal to start 20 world-class universities. The policy is out, and 10 of them will be in the public sector, 10 in the private sector. I think if that actually goes through and you have 20 universities which have the autonomy that they deserve to become world-class, that will be a very huge contribution.
Surjit, before we let you go, tell us the 5 things you expect and want this government to do in the next 6 months.
No, look, I think a rethink, what we've constantly thought of in India, not in most parts of the world, but India, is that we've mixed up production with pricing. Please, khuda ke waste, keep the two separate. You maximize income. Look, maximize growth. Absolutely necessary. Do what it takes. And then the growth gives you the taxes. Taxes allow you to redistribute. You know, this idea, the taxes have been there for thousands of years. Even the king. So the rich have always paid, and they always should pay. But at least do it efficiently, no?
Would you want an inheritance tax now?
I believe we should have, so the short answer is no. If somebody were to ask me, do I think India is at a stage where you even should be thinking of an inheritance tax, my answer is no. And there are various reasons for it. I think one of the big success stories of going forward in India, because of demonetization, is that you will be surprised by how much there is an increase in direct tax revenue.
So the solution is not to tax even more the people who are paying, but to bring in more people.
Exactly.
And
lower tax rates in order to bring in more people. Maximize revenue, not morality. Because what we have done throughout is maximize morality. The rich should pay more, they're bad people, they earn so much money. Kya milta hai?
Yeah, they should be.
And one other thing, I'm surprised you're not asking on capital gains tax. In 2002, we had long-term capital gains tax and short-term capital gains tax. So I looked into this, and actually I will take very immodest credit for bringing down the capital gains tax rates, not as much as it would have, and for bringing in the short-term transactions tax. But let me just give you the numbers. 900 crores was the total amount of income, tax revenue
from
you obtained, short-term and long-term, in 2002. Now, you get 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 of short-term securities transactions tax, and all your mumbo jumbo of capital gains tax gives you about 5,000. So, you know, imagine a tax. If it gets you a lot of revenue for very little effort and increased compliance, do it.
So think is a very good note to conclude this conversation on. And frankly, Surjit, if all your ideas are implemented, your next book will be not The Wealth of Nations, but The Wealth of India.
Yes.
So thank you very much, and thank you, Nandan. You made a wonderful part here.
Thank you.